Welcome, everyone, to the final installment of our fall 2021 Book Talk series. I am pleased to introduce Dr. Ari Mermelstein, who will speak about power and emotion in ancient Judaism, community and identity in formation. Dr. Mermelstein is Associate Professor of Bible and Second Temple Literature at YU. He holds a PhD in Ancient Jewish History from NYU's Department of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and a JD from NYU Law School. He's also the Assistant Director of the YU Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization and the Israeli Supreme Court Project at Cardozo. Dr. Mermelstein is currently working on a book project devoted to silence and speech in ancient Judaism. I'm particularly interested in seeing what that's all about.
Me too.
His previous book, Creation, Covenant, and the Beginnings of Judaism, Reconceiving Historical Time in the Second Temple Period. Does that all fit on the this previous book focuses on conceptions of history in the Second Temple period. Mermelstein co-chairs the Society of Biblical Literature's Bible and Emotion group. He has been teaching at YU since 2007 and has twice been voted the William L. and Lillian Silver Professor of the Year at Yeshiva College. An event like this takes a lot of dedicated people. I'd like to make a shout out, especially to Chaya Sarah-Cantor, who's at Hetty Steinberg Library, for her masterful writing skills and helping with logistics. I'd also like to thank for their help with promoting this event, Paul Glassman, Director of Libraries, Jay Rosen, who's also helping tonight, and the Marcom staff. Dr. Mermelstein.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for spending some time with me to just hear a little bit about my research and the subject of my recent book. Shalamis, thank you very much for coordinating, for organizing, for inviting me to participate this evening. And I think what we'll do is I will just give you a little bit of an idea about my book, contents, and then I think after a certain amount of time, maybe I'll stop and we'll take questions. But I think maybe we'll reserve questions for the end. This way, I just have a chance to speak for a certain amount of time. So, so feel free to insert your questions into the chat. But I think we'll be holding off on questions until a little bit later. Okay, so let me start with the basic thesis of my book, and then try to flesh out its theoretical and textual underpinnings. So the book is called Power and Emotion in Ancient Judaism, Community and Identity in Formation. And before I even get to the texts themselves, the Jewish texts that I'm studying, let me just try to elaborate on what each of those terms means, what I mean by power and emotion, what I mean by community and identity. So essentially, I argue that in addition to sets of practices and beliefs, what defined one's Jewish identity in antiquity, at least according to the authors of texts that I analyze in the book, was a specific set of emotions that distinguished Jews from rival Jewish communities and the Gentile world at large. These emotions reflected Jewish beliefs about God and divine power. And by feeling Jewish, and I'm intentionally using that phrase, feeling Jewish, that is having emotions that in some way reflected their Jewishness, Jews were able to recapture a sense of agency in a world that otherwise provoked feelings of uncertainty, alienation, and powerlessness. And that really is fundamentally the thesis of the book. In trying to unpack that thesis, and before getting to a discussion of the Jewish sources, I want to explain the following components of that thesis. First of all, how are emotions related to identity? In what sense are emotions reflections of belief? So that is, what do I mean by the Jewishness of these emotions? And what do emotions have to do with power? Before I even get to those questions, a word on why the topic of emotions is so important. Emotions are among the most foundational elements of human experience. They help prepare us for action. They add depth and vividness to our experiences. They assist in the production of memories. They're a form of communication, both verbal and nonverbal that aid us in navigating social interactions. And at the level of society, the range of acceptable emotions serves to regulate behavior and minimize deviance. Emotions have been the subject of intensive reflection going back to Aristotle and subsequent legions of Greek and Roman writers who are really interested in understanding how emotions can be harnessed effectively by rulers, by orators, and who are also interested in understanding the role that emotions have to play in the achievement of virtue and the living of a good life. Over the past 40 years, emotions have become the subject of analysis in every corner of academic inquiry, precisely because they are such a fundamental component of human experience. I began this research project in 2011, right around the time that I was finishing my PhD. And at that time, little work had been done on the subject of emotion in Judaism, ancient Judaism at all. And my very open-ended objective in kind of formulating my research agenda was just to try to understand what emotions meant within the ancient Jewish experience and whether those texts can make any sort of meaningful contribution to the exploding academic discourse on the topic of emotion. Okay, and now to emotions themselves. We often think about emotion as something instinctual, mechanical, and neural. I see a snake and I cower in fear. Someone cuts me in line at the supermarket and I explode with anger. Someone manages to get a selfie with a celebrity, and this is an example it draws from the inspiration of my daughters. Someone manages to get a selfie with a celebrity and I'm filled with envy. I am exposed as the person secretly stealing my neighbor's newspaper and bow my head in shame. That's not autobiographical at all. The popular approach to emotion sees the emotional responses in each such case as subconscious bodily responses in specific circumstances. That really is, I think, the way in which we generally conceive of emotions, and that account is partly true. Neuroscientists can, in fact, isolate the physiological events associated with each of those cases, but researchers in the hard and social sciences and disciplines across the humanities, again, especially from the last 40 years or so, argue that emotions don't only consist of subconscious bodily responses to external stimuli. Emotions also consist of a cognitive element which evaluates the effect that the stimulus has on me. Okay, so that is three components that scholars across various areas of academic inquiry now agree are at the core of emotional experience: cognition, evaluation, and self-interest. And in truth, those dimensions of emotional experience really go as far back as Aristotle himself. And so these are not, even if they've been sort of rediscovered over the course of the last decades, it's really something that goes back far into antiquity. Emotions reflect beliefs about which objects, people, or behaviors are so dangerous as to be worthy of fear, so offensive as to arouse shame or anger, so indispensable as to merit love or grief upon its loss, so reprehensible as to inspire hate, so helpless as to deserve pity, or so worthless as to merit disgust. Given the importance of emotions and the fact that they contain this evaluative element, groups have a vested interest in expecting that members will develop a certain emotional style. That emotional style should be one that conforms to the way that the group views the social world. These expectations, which researchers refer to generally as feeling rules, are not generally transmitted explicitly, but rather are learned through observation and everyday social interaction. In order to avoid sanction as someone whose emotions are not consistent with cultural expectations, sort of so-called outlaw emotions, we internalize the feeling rules and intuitively conform to them. Let me give an example that will illustrate what feeling rules are, how they operate, and how they both reflect and produce a broader set of values. Again, drawing upon the popular conception of emotion, both in ancient and in modern times, popular imagination celebrates the so-called strong, silent type of man, one who is bereft of emotion and instead is governed strictly by logic and rationality. Society sanctions the overly emotional man by calling into question his masculinity. By contrast, the popular imagination views women as especially susceptible to emotion. Accordingly, unemotional women are not described as rational, but rather as cold and calculating. The exception to those feeling rules, again, as conceived of in the popular imagination, is the emotion of anger. The popular imagination considers anger to be acceptable, even admirable for men, as a demonstration of passion and strength. By contrast, female anger is interpreted as shrill and a sign of hysteria. Feeling rules such as these aren't simply meant to govern responses to specific situations, but rather to teach us broader lessons about masculinity and femininity in general. And that's what I mean when I talk about the intersection, the interplay between beliefs, worldview, and emotions. The fact that emotions are conventions that reflect group preferences, values, and a broader worldview means that emotions can be subject to historical inquiry. Historians of emotion scrutinize how emotions, both as a category, emotions in general, and as individual emotions, anger, disgust, shame, etc., how each of those has been understood in specific local and historical contexts. Historians of emotion also emphasize which emotions have been typical of a certain community or era, how those emotions relate to wider social, material, and intellectual trends, and what accounts for historical change in the area of emotion. The major takeaway from the historical study of emotion is an increased awareness that emotions are not stable or enduring across time and space, which is a conclusion that should allow us to better interrogate our own emotional worlds. As a historian, I'm interested in the historical study of emotion, and I open my book with a basic question. What determines whether and how emotions change over time? I suggest that power, a concept that I'll unpack momentarily, is what's responsible for historical change in emotion. I should be clear from the example I gave a moment ago about the feeling rules associated with men and women. Emotions in the form of feeling rules play an important role in arranging the power dynamics among members of a group. So if men are expected to be unemotional and rational, and women are expected to be emotional and hysterical, then the feeling rules serve to deprive women of power and exclude them from domains that require reason and rationality. One good example of the interplay between power and emotion in this regard is the argument made against granting women the right to vote in the period before the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. According to this argument, women were too emotional to deserve that right. I'm going to share my screen and just show you a passage that I think illustrates this argument and the interplay between power and emotion generally very well. So this is a quote from an article written in 1919 entitled "Virginia Anti-Suffrage Committee Memorializes Assembly." The average woman, by her training and habits of life and thought and estimations of things, really is far less qualified to make a wise and safe voter than the average man. The same concentration of interests and emotional tendencies and sensitiveness to sympathetic influence that make her a better nurse and mother than the man make her a more dangerous and untrustworthy voter. But we are asking to pitch her headlong into practical politics. And therefore, who are we to grant these overly emotional, hysterical women the right to vote? The reason that emotions help arrange power relations is because our emotions are provoked by and produced within social interactions, and the form and content of social interactions are governed by power. And so that is because both power and emotion are fundamental elements of social interaction in general. Emotions play this really important role in helping us arrange power relations. The dynamics of social interactions and the power relations that underlie them will change depending on the emotions that such interactions provoke. But just to take a few examples as illustrative, grief is produced by a feeling of helplessness. Shame is caused by a feeling of disapproval in the eyes of another. Disgust is directed at something or someone I regard as inferior, even other. Forms of pity can imply a sense of superiority over someone else because I flourish while he or she suffers. Anger is a response to a perceived slight or injustice and is therefore an emotion reserved for someone at or below me on the social hierarchy. Whether someone or something causes me any of these emotions, grief, shame, disgust, pity, or anger, will be determined by how I evaluate that someone or something. And the power relations that result from that evaluation will reinforce and deepen my emotion. Power comes in different varieties, and emotions are associated with all of them. Power can be something that one person wields over another, what researchers refer to as power over. In a relationship of power over, one party can inflict pain or even death on another person. More subtly, power over can shape the behavior of those subject to it without operating through physical force at all. And this is what researchers refer to as domination. Going back to the example of gender relations, the historical subordination of women is a classic example of domination. People can also refer to an ability or capacity to accomplish my goals, what researchers call power to. This form of power need not involve other people, though a group can endow or deprive individuals of their capacities to achieve goals. To put simply, the distinction between power over and power to, power over entails the ability to affect others, and power to involves the ability to effect outcomes. There's one really critical point to understand about the relationship between power and emotion. Power relations don't precede the onset of emotion. Rather, emotions are involved in arranging power relations in the first place. Power is not a possession or something that inheres in certain types of interactions. Power constrains the range of actions without predetermining how one will respond. Resistance to power is always an option, and resistance is what allows a person to recapture power too. The power dynamics that govern interpersonal relations are always under negotiation, and emotions play a central role in that negotiation. So let me give a couple of examples that come out of my book. Martyrdom illustrates well why the arrangement of power is not predetermined, but emerges from within the interaction as a function of the party's emotions. In ancient instances of martyrdom, a ruler tried to compel others to perform actions on pain of death. So for example, Antiochus IV, the Seleucid king whose persecution of the Jews in year 167 eventually led to the rise of the Hasmonean state, Antiochus IV tried to compel the Jews to eat non-kosher food. Similarly, later Roman officials tried to compel Christians to renounce Jesus by compelling them to sacrifice to the Roman gods. If Antiochus or the Roman official managed to compel the Jew or Christian to act against their will on pain of death, they acquired power over the defendants. However, resistance to power was always a possibility. The defendant in these cases could welcome death and use the king's threat as a source of self-empowerment. That is, if one refused to bow to the king's pressure and submit to an excruciating death, one would reap the rewards due a martyr. Martyrdom could thus be an exercise in power too. Alternatively, a defendant could claim that God will punish the king for his actions, in which case the defendant actually becomes the source for the king's punishment, thereby turning the tables and exercising power over the king. Emotions play a critical role in the negotiation of power here. If the king manages to inspire fear in the defendants, the latter will succumb to the pressure and the king will acquire power over. Conversely, if the threat actually produces hope for the defendants, because his or her worldview leads him or her to evaluate the situation differently, then power will be arranged in an entirely different way. So the first three words in my title allude to this complex relationship between power and emotion. What about the subtitle, Community and Identity in Formation? So historians of emotion speak of emotional communities, which is a term that was coined by historian Barbara Rosenwein, who's one of the pioneers of the school of historians of history of emotions. In Rosenwein's words, an emotional community is a group, quote, in which people adhere to the same norms of emotional expression and value or devalue the same or related emotions. So this concept of an organic group of people that in some way subscribes to a similar set of emotional norms, that concept captures what I've already described as the social and conventional nature of emotion. So that is the idea of feeling rules. And it reminds us that as historians, our inquiry into the history of emotion should be delimited in time and space. Within my framework of power and emotion, an emotional community prescribes, either explicitly or more commonly implicitly, the feeling rules that both produce and are reinforced by the power dynamics in social life. One's identity as a member of such a community thus depends on whether one succeeds in shaping one's emotional life to conform to that community's set of feeling rules. And so it's in that way, using this model of an emotional community, that we can begin to talk about emotions historically. The theoretical framework I've explained until now informs my textual analysis, which is the heart of the book. The texts I study are Second Temple period Jewish texts, ranging from the 2nd century BCE until around 100 CE, so just after the destruction of the Second Temple, approximately in the year 70 CE. I'll have more to say about each of these texts shortly. Not going to be able to address all of them, but at least I'll have an opportunity to speak about some of them. The data set that I cover in the book includes works known as First Maccabees, Third Maccabees, Fourth Maccabees, Joseph and Asenath, Fourth Ezra, and various sectarian texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Ancient Jewish texts provide a particularly compelling historical lens through which to examine this relationship between power and emotion. Ancient Jews were caught in a web of power relations that left their imprint in the material, military, economic, political, and religious spheres. As the power of a string of foreign empires, the Hellenistic empires first of the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, the Roman Empire beginning in the 1st century BCE and forward, as the power of all of those foreign empires that ruled over the Jews grew, so do Jewish understandings of divine power. God's power exceeds that of the foreign empires, simultaneously restoring agency to Jews, a visible minority, and amplifying another form of power, namely divine power with authority over Jews. Religious developments in this new socio-political reality also served as the basis for power struggles among different groups of Jews. New forms of religious piety, which were now understood as essential to redemption and essential to the restoration of political and religious sovereignty, assumed great significance and became the basis for internecine strife and sectarian schism. Religious groups likewise competed for control of the temple, which was the locus of divine presence throughout the Second Temple period. And in all of these ways, the foreign empire, God, and other Jews all had the potential, this cumulative potential, to deprive Jews of a sense of agency and induce in them feelings of vulnerability. In my book, I argue that emotions were one important tool available to Jews for negotiating these various networks of power. The authors of the texts I included in my book argue that by feeling Jewish, so that is, by internalizing feeling rules that reflect one's commitment to and understanding of the Jewish God, again, that's the way in which worldview begins to intersect with emotional experience. So the idea of feeling through the idea of feeling Jewish, Jews would acquire a different evaluation of earthly power that would enable them to overcome the experience of powerlessness. The emotional expressions in these texts were shaped by and responses to feelings of uncertainty, alienation, and powerlessness. Using the framework of emotional communities developed by historians of emotion, I suggest that in addition to sets of practices and beliefs, what defined one's Jewish identity in antiquity was a specific set of emotions that, like Jewish practices and beliefs in general, distinguished Jews from rival communities and the Gentile world at large. Now, it's very important to understand what I am and am not claiming in making that statement. I don't claim to have access to the emotions of actual Jews. That's beyond the scope of my study and would be very difficult to demonstrate. Instead, what I'm doing is analyzing literary representations of emotions in works that outline what their authors regard as the ideal emotional style of ancient Jews. So that is, when an author sits down and tries to articulate what for that author is the ideal emotional set of experiences that all Jews should subscribe to, It's those kinds of representations that I'm looking at, but I'm not looking at how Jews actually responded to those literary works, which is information that unfortunately is really probably beyond what we are capable of getting at. Whether Jews actually embrace those emotions in practice is a difficult one. The authors of the texts that I analyze argue that Jews must feel Jewish. That is, as I said, that Jewish identity and membership in an emotional community is contingent upon internalizing and displaying a certain set of emotions that are unique to Jews and reinforce Jewish distinctiveness in the ancient world. That's what I'm arguing in the book. It means to feel Jewish, emotions and feeling rules that in some way set Jews apart within their larger world. These writers, some of whom lived in the Greco-Roman context of the diaspora, while others of whom lived in Israel, did not always agree about which emotions define one's Jewish identity, but they did agree that Jewishness entails some type of emotional style. And again, if we understand emotions as intimately connected with identity, we can understand why that would be. Let me be a little bit more specific about the types of issues that Jews faced and how Jewish feeling rules enabled them to address those issues. Jews living in the diaspora, both in Rome and in the Eastern Roman provinces, were not typically the objects of persecution or of oppression, but Jews nonetheless did experience hostile relations with the surrounding culture at different times and in different places. For example, Jews in Alexandria in Egypt did not always have an easy time coexisting with their Greek neighbors, and the Roman world, both in Rome and in areas of the Near East, may have been particularly hostile to Jews in the aftermath of the Jewish rebellion against Rome in the year 66 CE. So hostility was there even if oppression, persecution weren't. The major criticism directed at Jews was that they suffered from misanthropia. So that is the Greek word signifying hatred of all humanity, which of course is related to the English word misanthropy. So Jews suffered from hatred of all humanity. That claim was supported by virtue of the laws that inevitably separated Jews from the outside world. So laws governing marriage, governing Sabbath law, governing laws of purity, laws of kosher food, all of those things that in some way set Jews off from the outside world were understood within this context as indicative of Jewish hate. The result of this criticism and the hostility sometimes associated with it is that diaspora Jews did not always have an easy time integrating into their surroundings. Put in terms of power, non-Jewish hostility toward the Jews in such time and places deprived Jews of their power to acculturate because of the stereotype of Jews as haters of humanity. I argue in my book that a number of Jewish sources respond to this powerlessness rooted in a stereotype about Jewish hate. Let me give one example of how Jews can be seen as responding to this stereotype about Jewish hate. Book of Joseph and Asenath, which is generally regarded as a Jewish work composed in Greek by an Egyptian at some point during the first centuries BCE or CE, provides an imaginative background to the marriage of Joseph, the monotheist, and Asenath, the polytheist, that is Yosef and Asnat bat Potiphera from Genesis 41. How exactly did they come to that union? As a polytheist early in the book, Asenath hates all men and responds angrily to her father's suggestion that she marry Joseph. This emotional disposition is surprising, considering that anger in the Greco-Roman world was an emotion associated with power and the virtue of masculine courage in the private and public lives of men. Women, on the other hand, were associated especially with the emotion of pity. Asenath's formal introduction to Joseph, however, was a transformative event that triggered her journey toward monotheism. Her religious conversion was accompanied by an emotional transformation, one which sees her repudiate anger and teach men that pity, not anger, is actually associated with power. In the final section of the book, God protects this new convert, Asenath, formerly polytheist, now a follower of God, God protects her from angry, vengeful, and violent displays of manly courage by some of Joseph's brothers. But instead of resorting to anger when she has an opportunity to seek revenge and deploy power over them, Asenath instead opts for pity and leaves their fate to God. This emotional change is a product of her conversion. When she realizes that her idols are powerless and that God alone possesses power, she rejects the belief in human forms of power and therefore rejects anger as an emotion of the powerful. In doing so, Asenath demurs from the feeling rules and the associated values of the dominant culture. Without anger as its guide, courage, or in Greek, andreia, which literally means manliness, does not lead to conflict, but to peace. The courageous person, according to Joseph and Asenath, awaits divine protection while simultaneously behaving with pity toward one's adversaries. Defined in this way, courage promotes love of humanity, that is, philanthropia, love of humanity, not misanthropia, not hatred of humanity. According to the author of this work, those who feel Jewish acquire the power to cultivate what the Greco-Roman world regarded as a virtuous life, one that is inspired by this love of humanity rather than hatred of humanity. Joseph and Asenath resists gendered emotional norms in order to demonstrate the very different relationship between emotion and power that emerges from a belief in God's power. Women and their emotions are only powerless in a world whose sources of power are at odds with God's power, that is, in a world dominated by polytheism. Jews, however, according to this author, subscribe to a different set of feeling rules based on their distinctive beliefs. The book's subversive outlook on gender and emotion actually serves to make a broader point about Jewish values. The author's focus on gender is actually really a pretext used to prove that a minority group committed to a belief in one God can regain its sense of agency and profoundly and proudly defend its own set of values. The leading character in Joseph and Asenath expresses her opposition to anger in order to provide a definition of courage that would facilitate rather than undermine love of humanity. Again, philanthropia, a virtue that, as I said before, ancient Jews were accused of violating. On the other hand, the polytheistic men who are jealous of Joseph are the destabilizing sources of hate in society. The book's author thus engages the accusation that Jews are haters of humanity and argues that actually by virtue of their belief in the unrivaled power of God, Jews are uniquely capable of remaining faithful to their God and also contributing to the ambient culture. According to the book, only a monotheist, an outsider to Greco-Roman life, can identify genuine courage, that is, an anger-free display of loving pity. The author makes this point forcefully by portraying the monotheist as the ultimate outsider, as a female who has voluntarily abandoned polytheism. The female convert thus teaches the male polytheists about the true definition of manly emotions and virtues, with both gender and religion highlighting the inversion of values. This dynamic illustrates well the relationship between domination and emotion. In an alternative worldview, such as monotheism, necessarily effects a change in emotion, allowing for the possibility of resistance. Hostile relations and the absence of power to acculturate was one thing, but persecution on the part of the empire was an entirely different source of powerlessness for Jews in antiquity. The form of brute power over, in such cases, threatened Jews with death and deprived them of their own power to practice their religion. Yet the power dynamics were not predetermined, and this is something that I alluded to earlier. In order for the king to acquire power over and deprive the Jews of power too, the king would have to provoke them to fear. Instead, the Jews recapture power by demonstrating emotional resistance. And in a work from the 1st century CE known as 4th Maccabees, the Jews repudiate fear, embrace hope, and look forward to receiving divine reward for their martyrdom. In a work known as 1st Maccabees, which is the background to the Hasmonean rebellion and eventually the overcoming of Seleucid rule, in the 160s BCE. In First Maccabees, Mattathias, Matityahu, and his family, the Hasmoneans, the Hashmonaim, exhibit righteous anger, actively taking up arms rather than embracing death at the hands of Antiochus. In both cases, both Fourth Maccabees and First Maccabees, Jewish emotions are shaped by the religious beliefs of those being persecuted, and those beliefs enable those being persecuted to evaluate the threat differently and experience a different set of emotions that enables them to recapture power to observe their religion, whether that entails dying a martyr's death or responding with righteous anger in defense of God's law. Challenges to Jewish power did not always originate with their non-Jewish neighbors. Sometimes it actually came from rival Jewish groups. I devote several chapters in the book to the feeling rules prescribed by some of the texts associated with the Dead Sea group, known as the Yachad. Unlike the other texts I analyze in the book, the Yachad's texts are particularly important because we know a fair amount about this community on the basis of its writings. We're familiar, for example, with details about their initiation process, their beliefs, their laws, their rituals, their liturgy, their internal governments, and group life. And archaeological finds at the site of Qumran further allows us to fill out this picture. We have a unique opportunity with these texts, in the case of the sectarian texts from the Dead Sea Scrolls, to paint a picture of an emotional community and not simply one text whose origins are unknown, let's say, as is the case with First Maccabees or Fourth Maccabees or Joseph and Asenath, where we're dealing with one work in isolation. Here, we can do a relatively good job of kind of painting a rich picture of this community, its beliefs, and its emotions. This community, which refers to its members as the sons of light and its Jewish enemies as the sons of darkness, regarded itself as the only group still bound to God in a covenantal relationship and thought that it alone would enjoy redemption with the imminent onset of the end of days. Their texts reveal a very strong insider-outsider consciousness. Their opponents were impure, corrupt, rebellious, and because only members of this group, only members of the Yachad, received instruction in the correct observance of Jewish law, all outsiders were necessarily sinners and would be condemned. Yet despite this acute sense of difference, the Yachad allowed outsiders to join the group, and if, as many scholars suspect, this group was celibate, then the Yachad may have depended on the arrival of new adult members. This posed a fundamental problem. What if new arrivals would prove not to be committed to the teachings of the group? The presence of imposters would blur the boundary between inside and outside with the introduction of sin and impurity into the group, as well as the impact that the demonic forces associated with sinners could now have on the group once imposters managed to penetrate their ranks. The theological problem posed by the possibility that undeserving initiates had penetrated ranks of the group, that theological problem was disempowering precisely because it might deprive the sect of the power to achieve redemption that they had awaited with great anticipation. This disempowerment was associated with, both produced by and then reinforcing the emotion of fear. But the Yachad didn't diminish that fear, and to the contrary, they actually sought to amplify it. There could, they said, indeed be imposters in their midst, but the sect offered what it characterized as the antidote to this fear: love for the sect and passionate hatred for all outsiders. God would handle the fate of sinners, both inside and outside. For individual sectarians to stay safe from the taint of imposters, however, they had to commit themselves to love the sect wholeheartedly and hate everyone else. In order to make the emotional experience of fear, love, and hate more vivid and urgent, the Yachad even structured rituals that were meant to function as real-world instantiations of these emotions. In one such ritual, known to scholars as the annual covenant renewal ceremony, members of the sect would convene to remind themselves of God's hate for outsiders and love for insiders, and they would recommit themselves to these same emotions. Remarkably, the liturgy for the ritual, as described in surviving texts, includes the priestly blessings of Numbers chapter 6, the so-called Birkat Kohanim, which calls upon God to bless the covenantal people. in a twist that reflects group ideology and serves to produce the emotions of love and hate, the priestly blessing was only directed at members of the sects, and they appended to the biblical blessing a curse, which was formulated as a precise inversion of the blessing directed at all outsiders. But they reserved the harshest curse for the impostor who had gained entrance to the group. He and the demonic forces associated with him were undoubtedly present, but individual sectarians could remain safe by properly orienting their emotions in relation to insiders and outsiders. If sectarian fear of the presence of sin could provoke fear and an experience of disempowerment, then their love and hate would restore their power to achieve redemption. The sectarian strategy across a range of texts was to strengthen sectarian commitments by tying sectarian beliefs about the power of the sect to achieve redemption with emotions that these texts identified as uniquely sectarian in nature. Sectarian emotion was based on the belief that God had elected them and rejected all others, and on the understanding that God had revealed to this group special doctrines, special laws, and special understanding about their place within the cosmos. So accordingly, sectarians were expected to love fellow sectarians and hate all outsiders, emotions that were understood to mirror those of God himself. As with emotions generally, sectarian emotions reflected the Yachad's value system, and by enabling group members to evaluate the relationship between them, outsiders, and God differently, restored to themselves power and a sense of agency. If the other texts I've spoken about earlier urged Jews to feel Jewish, these texts instructed community members how to feel like a sectarian. There's obviously much more to say about the topic of power and emotion in ancient Judaism in particular, and in the world of emotion in general. I've only had really an opportunity tonight to touch upon about 3 or 4 of the 8 ancient Jewish works that I discuss in the book. But I hope what I've managed to do is give you a little bit of an appreciation for why the topic of power and emotion is an important and compelling one, why the context of ancient Judaism, I believe, is an especially fruitful one in which to explore this topic, and how theory in general can be used productively in analyzing ancient Jewish texts in general. Thank you very much. I guess we will take questions. I think we have time for some questions. If anybody has questions, feel free to just put them into the chat, or yeah, Shalom, I say, or you can just activate the raise hand function on Zoom. That's fine too. Shalom, you had your hand up? No.
Why do they even exist?
Hi, is it Hallie Chayasara Cantor?
Hey, yeah,
Hi.
it's me. Hi. I have kind of a bunch of questions, but can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay,
Sure.
good. Yeah, I was just wondering though how much, if I'm following correctly, there's, I guess there's a concept of Jewish soul. I mean, how much, you're talking, by the way, I'm from Chabad, so I've got my own ideas. But just the idea of the Jewish soul, how much like emotions maybe stem from that certain source, and not just, a general feeling. There's, like there is certainly an intellectual component.
I think you've muted yourself accidentally.
Heck, I'm sorry. Okay, do you see, I don't know, any, I guess, broader basis for our reaction, or maybe there's, just a divine connection, or just a passion for Torah? Because I could even see this, the idea of martyrdom. First of all, legally, you have to give up your life in certain situations. It doesn't matter what your emotions are. I mean, do they have to feel a certain way? So I'm just not sure at what point you have the feeling, or just the whole legal requirements. It seems like it's. Oh, hello.
Yeah, I can hear
I
you.
lost you there. Yeah. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or,
So I think that it's important, once we begin to recognize that emotions are not just some sort of diffuse feeling, just neuron firing, but there's
yeah,
an element to them. So I think that takes the edge off of your question, namely, necessarily requires emotion, because emotions are can't be distinguished from cognition. They effectively evaluate all forms of social interaction, and so so I'm not sure that there's any way in which we could exclude emotion from any of the examples that you gave. I think is a wonderful example of the topic in general of power and emotion. I've written a couple of articles more recently on the connection between law and emotion, and specifically the way in which the laws of kashrut, the laws of kosher food, were understood as having certain emotional resonances with Jews. When Jews, for example, came into contact with non-kosher food, what sort of emotions did that provoke in them? For example, there's a story in which Rabbi Akiva encounters prostitutes, Roman prostitutes, and he's accosted by a Roman governor, and the Roman governor wants to see if he can deceive Rabbi Akiva, sends a couple of women in to try to seduce Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva spends the night simply spitting at them, and in the morning the Roman governor says, "Why did you behave this way?" And he says, "I was overcome with the disgusting stench of non-kosher food on their breath." And so you can see, for somebody who was sort of conditioned to respond a certain way, he just naturally viewed, it wasn't something that he had to conjure up. It was a natural way of evaluating kosher food, because just as another example, the halacha is that if you're ill to the point to provide you with non-kosher food, if you say that you don't want to actually have somebody provide you with non-kosher food, we don't compel you to eat it, because we think that if you are resistant, you wouldn't be able to digest the food anyway. You would have such a disgust reflex to the non-kosher food that you would just necessarily vomit it out. And so, so disgust as a sort of way in which we respond to non-kosher food is one example of how law kind of conditions us to feel about things. As far as the question about the Jewish soul, I think that the closest that we come to talking about emotions and their association with some sort of innate Jewishness maybe is from the set of the Dead Sea Scrolls that I was describing. The Dead Sea Scrolls, some of them talk about an idea of predestination. So that is that members who end up in the group were predestined by God to join the group. And so there's something inherent in these people that maybe, even if they can't identify it, but God has somehow endowed them with some capacity. And so perhaps, that might be maybe the closest that we come to some sort of innateness that you were talking about. So, but thank you for your questions. Aaron, I saw you had, Aaron, can you ask your question? Because my chat function is playing games with me and having trouble reading it.
If you're willing to tolerate the background noise, I apologize.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just to probe a little bit what you think was going on behind these texts. Were the authors or leaders of some of the community aware of the constructed nature of the emotions that govern society and a community? Or does this work specifically because they were unconscious of it?
So does what work? Meaning what they were doing is basically producing these feeling rules? Is that?
Right. I mean, you theorize it so you can get behind it. Do you think that some of the more people in the leadership positions understood what they were doing? When the Hasmoneans write stories that someone is so disgusted by pork that they have no choice but to rise up and rage and exhibit anger, so they realize that actually has an effect on the community, that they're specifically trying to provoke that? Or do we assume that the ancient authors they're innocent and they're sort of pre-theoretical in that sense? We theorize, but they just do.
Yeah, so I think that it's a very good question. I think that there are a couple of things to keep in mind. There is a difference in general between the place of emotions in the Greek world and emotions in the Near East. The Greek world, the Greek and Roman world, was deeply non-Jewish. Greco-Roman world was deeply theorizing about emotions. Aristotle, the Stoics, this was a major topic of interest for them. So much of Philo's corpus is devoted to the topic of emotions. Josephus talks about emotions. Really, Greek writers in the diaspora context, in the Greek diaspora, clearly have a solid hold on what emotions are, what they do, how they can be deployed. So I think if we were talking about Greek authors, then I would say I think that there is a sense that, for example, when Joseph and Asenath, which is written in that context, talks about emotion, the author knows what he's doing. He's being self-conscious in his use of anger versus pity. Those are important emotions, and living within that Greco-Roman context, he couldn't have failed to understand what he was doing. I think it might be more complicated when we talk about the situation in my case, let's say with Eretz Israel. So if you're talking about, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls, those were really Dead Sea Scrolls, First Maccabees. I guess some of the works that I'm looking at are being written in Eretz Israel. So there, I think we're talking about emotions that were less theorized, right? We don't have good evidence that people living in Eretz Israel had as deep a philosophy of emotions as we find in the Greek world. There's no reason for thinking that. So it's possible that, when they try to shape emotions in a certain way, it's possible that they're doing so without any sort of self-consciousness. I think that, what's happening though in many of these texts is, even if they can't necessarily pinpoint, for example, what disgust means, they haven't been able to theorize what exactly disgust is. They understand the effect that disgust has on a person. They understand that disgust is a way of drawing boundaries around people, even if they can't articulate how that works. And so in other texts that I didn't just discuss, disgust is an important emotion in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's what they use to really characterize outsiders, and it's what they use to characterize their pre-sectarian selves. And I think that what is happening in those texts, it's not an unreflective use of the emotion of disgust. They're aware that what they're doing is deploying an emotion that will lead them to think about the outside world a certain way. So even while I agree that I don't think that they were as theoretically sophisticated as, let's say, their Greek and Roman counterparts, I do think there still is some way in which they understand the effect that emotions have on how we view the world. I tried to argue, and also in something I wrote after the book, that in the case of anger, that what you have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is the emotion of anger, even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is understood to be a particularly masculine emotion, and that masculinity and anger, I don't know if I said anger, masculinity and anger are associated in the Dead Sea Scrolls in ways that I think approximate what we find in the Greek context. So I think that there are maybe exceptions to what I was just describing. I think in general, we need to view even emotions in Eretz Israel in some way as being an outgrowth of that Hellenistic context. So I think even in Eretz Israel, it's a more complicated situation. Yeah, I appreciate the question.
May I ask a question if no one
Sure.
else?
Oh, sure.
And it's incidental, but it's one of those serendipitous things. I was trying to learn more about a Second Temple manuscript this year around Hanukkah time. I think it's been dated to about 7 Common Era, and it's Megillas Tanis, the Scroll of Fasting. And when you were talking about emotions, it wasn't just the time period, but it made me think about it because obviously they're the contrasting emotions of what one feels when one fasts versus one feasts and in a religious context. And I just wondered if that was a manuscript that you have looked at.
So Megillat Tanya, it's a complicated manuscript. There are multiple. There's sort of like the equivalent of the Mishnah, in classical rabbinical literature. The Mishnah is in Hebrew. the Talmud is in Aramaic. In the case of Megillat Tanit, it's the reverse. What is essentially the Second Temple substrate of the text is in Aramaic. Then there's a later sort of Talmud on it, which is in Hebrew. And the Hebrew Talmud, which is really the kind of rich explanation for all of the fast days that are described in that text, that's probably later. That's probably not Second Temple. Without that, we don't really have a good sense in many of those cases what those fasts are about. But I think that your question stands even if the example of Megillat Tanit is a little bit more complicated. I think that the question about fasting is an important one, namely, and it really, I think it gets at a larger question about the connection between ritual and emotion. What role does ritual play in provoking, in providing a context for the expression of, in itself being a performance of emotion? Those are the various possible ways in which rituals and emotions intersect. I think fasting would be one good example of a ritual context that is meant to provoke emotion. And we could talk about numerous other rituals. The ritual that I was talking about from the Dead Sea Scrolls, the annual covenant renewal ceremony, would be another such example. And I think that this was not something I went into at all tonight, but I think what rituals allow us to appreciate is also the role of the body in all of this. That was really something that I completely omitted from my presentation tonight, but it's important to understand the way in which the body figures in all of this. Our emotions are not disembodied ideas about the world out there. We experience the cognitions associated with emotion. We experience those in our body. And so what role does embodiment play when we're talking about provoking, producing? So those are I think the questions maybe that arise out of the particular case that you're talking about fasting. Megillat Tanit is a little bit more complicated.
Oh, just one.
Sure.
I just think, what was the title, the work that you described about Joseph and Asenath? What was the title?
It's Joseph and Asenath, which is spelled Aseneth.
Mm-hmm. Who's the author?
So we don't know. This is the ancient Jewish work. Probably it's preserved and probably written in Greek in Alexandria, Egypt, probably 1st century BCE or 1st century CE. We don't know who the author was.
Oh, it's not like available in a regular library type.
If you look at Google it, if you
Okay.
come with me afterwards, my email for anybody who wants to follow up in any way, my email is ari.mermelstein@gmail, or else mermels@yu.edu, the first 7 letters of my last name @yu.edu. Feel free to.
Okay. Oh, yeah, somebody here just put the info.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
So,
All right, great. Okay,
Shalom, thank you for doing that.
that's great. Okay.
Problem. Can I get a question in then?
Sure.
The connection to the body, would you say that is, I mean, you didn't elaborate on it there, but I mean, we've had conversations about this and we talked about disgust and so on. Is that something unique to sort of the ancient perception of emotion? Or does it, because you think of emotion, you think of that sort of separate from physical, right? I mean, I don't know, at least in my head, in my 21st century head. And does that tell us, is that something, is that different in the text you look at, or do you say that, or am I thinking about it incorrectly as a 21st century?
Meaning, are you where you're saying as a 21st century where we think about emotions as embodied or disembodied?
I don't know.
So I think in general, I think that I think that what the theory allows us to do, I think the theory of emotion theory in general, I think increasingly describes emotion as, the formulation that I've always found helpful is that emotions are embodied thoughts. So sort of the body is the meeting place of kind of the firing of neurons and the evaluation of the outside world. And that's what when we refer to emotions, we're referring to this phenomenon whereby cognition about the outside world and firing of neurons, sort of like distinction that the distinction that neuroscientists draws between feelings and emotions. Emotions maybe being the impulse, the neurons firing, feelings being the cognitive overlay. But the idea is that they're inextricable. You can't really talk about emotions in any way as disembodied. And the reason that particularly the religious context, religious examples are valuable is because of the importance of ritual. And you see, when you begin to see the place that emotions play within ritual. Rituals both provoke, express, perform, provide an opportunity for performing emotions. So I'm not sure. I think that that the religious ritual context actually allows us to expand our understanding of emotion rather than distinguishing between, let's say, antiquity and modernity.
Do they imagine God as how do they deal with God's emotions, right? Is that a problem for them? Is that something that later literature would find it as problematic?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and again, it will depend on the particular text you're talking about. The Dead Sea Scrolls talk very openly and very often about God's emotions of love and hate. They're insistent that God loves those he has who have been welcomed into the group. God hates those who have been excluded from the group. And the way in which they rewrite the right, the tripartite expectation of things that you're supposed to love, all of those things are mirrors of what God loves. You're supposed to direct your love not toward loving what God loves. You're not supposed to love God. You're supposed to love your fellow sectarian, because in doing so, all that you're doing is imitatio Dei. You are simply replicating God's love for your fellow sectarian. God also is repulsed by all outsiders. And so that's why you as a sectarian are expected to be repulsed by them as well. So certainly the Dead Sea Scrolls have a lot of love and hate language of God. On the other hand, Philo and other authors steeped within the Greek world are, object to the idea that you would have some sort of divine emotional set of experiences. So, so it certainly will be different depending on the time and place that you're talking about. Anger, obviously, you're talking about, let's say, First Maccabees, which was the example that I gave before of the Jews displaying righteous anger. So the Jewish righteous anger is really, in that case, a response to divine anger. It's basically inspired by it, takes its justification from the fact that God is already angry. And so divine anger is obviously plays a prominent role in a lot of these texts. Cases of martyrdom, certainly what the martyrs are building off of is the sense that God is now angry at the persecutor, and therefore by submitting to death, what they're basically doing is just activating God's anger, right? Basically deploying it so that God then goes ahead and punishes the person.
Okay. Okay.
I think if that's it, maybe Shalamis, maybe we'll kind of wrap things up.
Ari, before we wrap,
I see Marlene, you should just tell your husband right behind me is reclaiming.
Professor, before we wrap, do you want
Sure.
to just briefly mention the discount that's available for the book?
Sure. There is on my academia.edu page. Like I said, I'm having trouble with the chat function on my computer, but on my academia.edu page. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the website, just Google Ari Mermelstein, academia.edu. You'll see the top two documents on that page are the introduction to my book. And then just below that is a coupon that comes with a 20% discount. So if you're inclined to purchase the book directly from Cambridge University Press, then you can feel free to visit the academia.edu page, and you can use the discount code that you'll find there. Jay, thanks for reminding me.
Sure.
Yeah, also, I'm going to be emailing a follow-up to all the registrants, so I can send you the link as well. Thank you so much. This was fascinating. You know, who knew there
Thank
was
you
so much about emotion and Judaism, and like it really took on a lot of different directions that I was very pleasantly surprised to see.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me to present.
Okay. So thank you all for coming, and stay tuned. We're having a whole slew of spring events coming up, so you'll be getting emails about that. And this was really wonderful. Thanks again, Dr. Mermelstein.
All right. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Be well, be healthy.